You're listening to Sea to Sky podcast, For Sisters by Sisters with Marina Thompson and Dana Moreland. Brought to you by Sea to Sky alumni chapter of Alpha Omicron Pi. Welcome, everyone. This is our first episode in our virtual studio. We have Dana, the co-host, myself, Marina, and Ginger Banks, an AOPI treasure, a personal friend, and a past international president. Ginger initiated Pi Kappa in 1968 at the University of Texas. We're so happy to have you, Ginger.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, and thanks for taking the time to tell us today more about you, your AOPI journey, and any other things you want to share with us. So, Ginger, Marina and I, like you, are passionate about continuing our AOPI involvement as alumni. When did you or how did you become involved as an alumna member of AOPI after your graduation?
Well, when I was a senior at the University of Texas in Pi Kappa chapter, Dee Gardner was, as we called them at the time, traveling secretary, and she visited our chapter and encouraged me to apply to be one. And I was hired. And so for the first 2 years after I was out of the university, I traveled for AOPI all around the United States and some parts of Canada. And then the next year, after 2 years of being on the road, the executive committee, as it was termed at the time, hired me to be their administrative assistant. And in those days, we didn't have a headquarters staff. So the volunteers on the executive board and throughout the organization did everything. They did financial management, they did personnel management, they set the policies, they hired the traveling secretaries, and so they didn't have any help. And so I was administrative assistant to Janie Calloway, who was, I think her title at that point was vice president of operations, which meant she had all the collegiate chapters and traveling secretaries. And so I was assistant to her, and I worked out in an apartment in Austin, Texas, because I didn't want to move away from Austin. They said that was okay. So sitting at my typewriter, I did my work as administrative assistant. So I think I was working remotely before remote working was cool. So after that, one thing led to another, and I loved working at the international level. So I just stayed there and served in several international volunteer positions before I was elected to the executive board. And as a result, I've been continually involved at the international level of AOPI for 51 years. I can hardly get that number out of my mouth. But as I said, one thing led to another.
That is so impressive. So, Ginger, what would you say AOPI did for you, and how did the sorority shape the person you are today?
Oh my gosh. That's a great question, and one that I've thought about a lot during those 51 years, because I am absolutely convinced that AOPI had an immeasurable influence on me personally and professionally. And that happened because I stayed involved in AOPI, and I had various leadership and management opportunities. And over those years too, different phrases from ritual have popped into my head, and they have provided me guidance at various times. And AOPI taught me so much. I can't, as I said, it's just hard to quantify it all, but it taught me how to manage and interact with people and processes and budgets. And the more I learned about our founders and about our ritual, the more inspired I became and the more proud of AOPI I became. So there just never was a question in my mind about what my commitments would be because I believed in the organization. I wanted to give back to the organization. And I felt very, very fortunate that it seemed like I was in the queue for continuing to serve AOPI.
Ginger, you have had the opportunity to serve the fraternity as international president. You are now one of our most beloved past international presidents. Thinking about your time as international president, what are you most proud of?
Well, there's several things. First of all, let me give you a little historical context. In 1976, at the Chicago AOPI International Convention, a group of brave and far-sighted leaders came together and presented a resolution to our governing body, council, and the resolution was aimed at combining the two governing bodies of the fraternity. We had an executive committee. They had responsibility for personnel and appointments, and as I said, the traveling consultant program and managing our central office. And then there was the board of directors, and they had all the money. So when the executive committee wanted to start a new program or needed funds for something, they'd have to go begging the board of directors for it. And that was just really cumbersome process. So these far-sighted leaders proposed this resolution at convention, which council adopted. And what that resolution did was combine the executive committee and board of directors. In doing that, the aim of the resolution was to professionalize the fraternity's operations. At that time, we had a central office in Indianapolis, and I finally call it our filing cabinet in the sky, because we had no programming staff, we had clerical staff, and they maintained the membership records and financial records and got reports in and sent reports out and that kind of thing. But the resolution said we can't always rely on volunteers to do all this heavy lifting. So we need to professionalize the fraternity's operations by adding programming staff to our central office. So that happened in 1976, and I was elected international president 5 years later in 1981. So very much so in my first term as international president and the second term as well, we were knee deep in implementing that resolution and establishing our headquarters staff that's much more similar to what we have today, although not nearly as extensive. And that was a key goal. Another key goal was to let the regional vice presidents at the time, I guess today that would be compared to our networks. The regional vice presidents were in charge of running their regions, but before the resolution, the executive committee, in many instances, told them what to do. And the executive boards I was on decided it's the RVP's regions, let them run their regions. So in effect, we developed middle management system. So all of that was really important. And another huge thing for me was that also at the time I was in my first term, one of my dearest friends in the world, Sue Edmonds Lewis, was named executive director. Sue and I had known each other since we interviewed to be traveling secretaries in 1971. So here, 10 years later, we were in a position where I was international president. She was the new executive director. In effect, I was her boss, one of my dearest friends in the world. And we worked really, really hard before we knew we would assume those positions, like before we actually took them on. And we worked really, really hard in strategizing on how we would maintain our friendship, but also recognize our professional relationship, and never wanted it any of our friendship to be a hurdle or be any kind of detriment for the fraternity. Turned out it was, in our view, a huge asset because we knew each other so well. I felt like we could work together so well. So that was key also in establishing, I think, that relationship between the executive director and the international president. And one more thing that I'm proud about during that time was we bought our first headquarters building. Up until
Mm.
that time, we had rented in various places around the country. So, in a nutshell, I think highlights of my years as president was further implementing the resolution, because I am totally convinced that that was one of the most notable things that's ever happened in AOPI. It paved the way for where we are today, and I get goosebumps when I think about those fraternity leaders that had the gumption and the foresight to set the groundwork for that and set the wheels in motion. And I think all of them, most of whom who are deceased, would be extremely proud of what's developed.
As a just a little aside, my collegiate chapter was colonized during your time as international president, and now we call it chartering group, but the colony group. And Sue Lewis was one of the two women who interviewed me to be an AOPI. And so I've always felt just such, because you were my first international president, and that connection to Sue as well. The other
Oh, that's
interviewer,
great.
yeah.
See, that confirms what I've always thought. Sue had excellent judgment.
Well, thank you. My other interviewer was Barb Hunt. So,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, it was such a special day. So appreciate the accomplishments of your time as international president.
Thank you. And if you don't believe any of that, just ask me and I'll tell it to you all over again.
Wow, Ginger, this is such great information. Thank you for the
Mhm.
history lesson. As you mentioned, you've been in very many volunteer positions with AOPI from 1971 to 2022, you said. What would you say was your favorite one and why?
Well, I guess a lot of people would think being international president would be my favorite. And for the reasons I just recited, I'm very proud of that and I wouldn't trade it for anything. But in all honesty, my stint as chairman of the Rituals, Traditions, and Jewelry
Mhm.
Committee was my favorite role. And there are many reasons for that too. But when I first went on RT&J, the image of Rituals, Traditions, and Jewelry Committee was that they were very rigid. They were very dedicated to, and rightfully so, dedicated to encouraging members to conduct ritual exactly as the founders had written it and with the correct procedures. And they were adamant about a lot of the rules and regulations regarding ritual. And I don't fault them for that at all. That was their job. But as happens in a lot of organizations, the original scheme of things evolved. And when I got on RTNJ, we set several goals. And one of them was for the Rituals, Traditions, and Jewelry Committee to be a lot more accessible. We wanted people to feel comfortable to come to us with their questions and to give us suggestions. And we emphasize that we welcome input. And one of the ways that we tried to let things be a little less strict while still adhering to the principles and the way we thought things should be done was we decided that we wanted to make a ritual more accessible and fun. And during ritual workshops, I kid and say, have you ever thought of fun and ritual in the same sentence? But I'm absolutely convinced that ritual can be fun in terms of learning about it, learning about what the founders may have had in mind when they chose various aspects of it. And in many ways, we talk about the ritual being simple, but and it is very straightforward and not too cumbersome or too heavy duty, but it's also very intricate. And to see the different threads that tie different aspects of the ritual together, I think is just fascinating for those 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, our founders, to have put this thing together in such a way that it hasn't changed since they did that. We've changed a few procedural things just to make it more user friendly, but the words and the concepts and the principles haven't changed. So getting to be a part of that, being able to make ritual more accessible and fun was a huge goal and something that we really were proud to do and enjoyed doing it. And one of the ways we did that was we discussed the attire restrictions we had for many, many years. They took 2 pages in the International Book of Policies because they were so detailed and so rigid, and we tried to answer members' questions before they had to ask them through these policies. But we decided to lighten that up, and we changed their attire requirements so that they're a lot more lenient now. And we thought by doing that, we would lessen the reasons for excuses people had for not attending ritual. They didn't have the right shoes, they didn't have the right dress, the alumni couldn't come to a collegiate initiation or ritual after work because they would have on their work clothes and that wasn't suitable white attire for ritual, and on and on and on. So we really wanted to look at everything we could to make people want to come to ritual and not have it be a burden for them. Another thing that we did was, for the first time in 17 years, we revised the rituals book and the book of rituals instructions. Our goal was to make the rituals more consistent with each other, and to revise the book of ritual instructions to further facilitate our goal of fostering ritual education, and again help people be interested in pursuing that. And at that time, we also developed for the first time the ritual education manual, which provided modules for ritual education. And all of that was put together by RT&J and published in 2007. Well, then I guess it was 15 years later or something like that, while I was still on RT&J, we decided time to revise those publications again. So we did, and the 3 publications were revised. And just about the time I was going off of RT&J, a lot of work was done on the ritual education manual. It was greatly enhanced. So those publications were put out in 2022. So my whole experience on RT&J was great fun because I felt like we were really plowing new ground in terms of how our members could approach ritual and learn more about it. And oh yeah, by the way, use it in their everyday lives. Theory was, if they know more about it and how it can help them philosophically and even spiritually, that would be a very good thing. So those are the reasons why my stint on RT&J was my favorite AOPI responsibility.
Ginger, when you said make ritual fun, I don't know if you remember, but you were at my initiation in 2009 in Waterloo, and the chapter was only 2 years old at the time. And we had our I do's and whatnot. And then we sat down. My class was only 4 women. So we sat down and you chaired that workshop, that very first ritual workshop. And I just remember being so into it. I was just like,
Oh,
you
that's
just like
great.
captured me. And I was just, nothing else existed, nothing else mattered in that moment. So
Oh, that's great.
it was an amazing thing. And then I was chapter advisor for Beta Tau in the University of Toronto just a few years after I graduated. And the chapter was going through some rough patches. So I thought we need to connect these girls to their ritual. And that's why I invited you then to come and talk to them. And for the listeners, that's how Ginger and I became friends. She
Yes.
stayed over my parents' house for a few days while she was visiting Toronto, and we went to the CN Tower and dinner, and it was great fun.
It was great.
Um,
And the fact that Beta Tau helped me celebrate my birthday while I was there
Oh,
had a little influence on my very close ties to you and Beta Tau and the Canadian members of AOPI.
so
I think
sweet.
making ritual more accessible to our members, both collegiate and alumni, has been such a positive culture shift within the
Thank you.
fraternity. And I'm so appreciative of the work that RT&J has done over the last decade or so, to maybe close to two now, to really accomplish that.
Thank you.
Because ritual is fun and it is engaging, and why not make it more accessible?
Thank you, Dana. We were a little nervous about doing it at first, but we sort of dipped our toe in the water, and when we got positive response, we said, well, let's dive on in.
Let's take the
So
plunge.
I appreciate that
Yes,
impression.
absolutely. I know when I talk with alumni and collegiate members throughout the fraternity, many of them are surprised that our international volunteers are just that, volunteers, that we don't all work at headquarters, that the fraternity does not pay us a salary, and that our international volunteers, many of them have careers outside of AOPI. So let's turn to that, Ginger, and share with us about your professional career.
Okay. My background is in communications. I have a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas in journalism. And as I said a while ago, my first jobs out of college were working for AOPI as a traveling secretary and then administrative assistant. But then I decided, as my dad told me, I should get a real job. And so I offered to the executive board that I would continue serving as administrative assistant, but I better go and get a real job to further my journalism career. And my dad was incredulous because he was a journalist and he did a lot of moonlighting. He would write magazine articles for, to sell to magazines. After work, and he'd get paid for that extracurricular activity. And he said, so let me make sure I understand this. You're going to have a day job. And I said, yes. And he said, but then your sidebar job is going to be doing the same thing you've been doing for AOPI for a year. But the only difference is going to be you're not going to get paid for it anymore. And I said, that's it. So if there's any doubt, I was hooked. But anyway, I ended up, I was fortunate to work at the State Bar of Texas in communications for about 25 years. And it amazed me, and all that time, a lot of that time was when I was serving on the executive board, which was like a full-time job. So I said, during those years, it was like having two full-time jobs because and those were in the days before computers and email. So I would come home and do my work on a typewriter and mail out reports, doing snail mail and all that. So it was very time consuming, but I really enjoyed it. And I never had really thought about AOPI being a benefit to me in my career, but I never would have accomplished what I did at the State Bar of Texas or being able to be recognized and being offered the responsibilities that I had or reaching the salary that I had. I'm convinced that none of those things would have been possible if I hadn't had professional experience in AOPI, but as a volunteer. And here's some examples of that. With my journalism degree and having had, being able to show the executive director of the State Bar when he was interviewing me, various forms of communications I had written and handled. When he hired me, he knew that I could edit a 126-page magazine that came out each month. He knew I could do that, but he also expected me to be able to hire, manage, train, fire staff, deal with contracts for printing and typesetting of the magazine, and manage a $1 million budget. Well, the University of Texas didn't teach me how to do those things, and neither did the State Bar of Texas. But guess who did? AOPI. Think back about when I was Sue Lewis's supervisor, when she was executive director. Sue Lewis could do anything. I mean, you talk to her about budgets or real estate or programming. She was just a master of all trades. So I learned a lot from her and from that experience of my managing her. And throughout other AOPI responsibilities, most especially on the executive board, I learned how to, well, I was in charge of the traveling consultant program when I was administrative assistant.
Mhm.
So I learned how to coordinate a major program, to plan the visit schedules of the traveling secretaries, to handle their hiring, their supervision, their training, their management. AOPI taught me how to do all of that. As I said, let me put it this way, I would have been at a loss as managing editor of the Texas Bar Journal, which is what I was initially hired to do, if I hadn't had that management experience through AOPI.
Mhm.
The other thing that I found to be so fantastic was that the things I learned in AOPI benefited me at the state bar, not only in the way I performed, but in ideas I had for training or programs or whatever. And by the same token, the State Bar of Texas helped me in things I was able to do for AOPI in different programs or processes or whatever the state bar had. I could apply them in AOPI. So it was, talk about synergy. It just amazed me how many times when I was working on AOPI things, I would think, oh, well, we did such and such at the state bar. Maybe that would be good to think about using an AOPI here. And just exactly the opposite was true. So my volunteer experience in AOPI and my professional experience at the state bar was just intertwined to the point that sometimes I had to pinch myself to remind me which organization I was working for at the moment.
That is
So
so
it,
impressive.
it
Mhm.
was it was a great relationship and a great synergy. And I was so thankful that the state bar was so supportive of my work on the executive board, because I end up using more than my vacation time to go to board meetings and chapter installations and things like that. And I'll never forget when the opportunity came up for me to serve a second term as international president, which had been done previously, but not in a long, long time. I wrote the executive director a memo and explained to him what it would involve, and it would be kind of more of the same. And
Mhm.
what did he think about that? And I'll never forget, I gave him a hard copy of the memo, and he wrote in handwriting across the top, "Go for it, Ginger. You honor us by serving."
I love that.
And that was awesome. And I think the reason was he had seen that my experience in AOPI had benefited me as a staff member of the state bar, and the state bar had benefited as a result. So I couldn't be more grateful for and happy about that time I was working professionally for the state bar and as a professional volunteer for AOPI.
Wow, it is always so great when you have a manager who can see past their own nose and like
Yes.
really see
Oh,
how these intertwined responsibilities and how it all comes together and everyone
Mhm.
comes
oh,
ahead as a
that's
result.
such a treasure. And as you say, doesn't always work out that way. I later on in my subsequent years at the state bar, I worked for two executive directors who were not at all that way. So
Mm.
my timing was great.
And we're very lucky too.
Yes.
Thank you.
So you spoke a lot about all of these transferable skills and activities, and I was wondering what other things you like to dedicate your time to. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you balance it all?
Sure. Well, when I was on the executive board for those 8 years, as I said, it was like having two full-time jobs, and AOPI was the choice for my work I did in my quote unquote spare time. And there wasn't any doubt in my mind that that would be it. And so, because it was so demanding and consuming, the AOPI responsibilities and the state bar responsibilities, I really didn't get involved in many other organizations. And I never was particularly involved in the Austin Alumni chapter because I figured my AOPI involvement was at the international level and doing a lot of traveling, and just being involved locally was not really an option, but it was a choice I was happy to make. So really the first time I had some opportunities to indulge in some local activity was when I retired. And at that point, I had spent so much time in my spare time limited to AOPI that when I retired, it was like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed with the possibilities of other things I might do. So I continued my AOPI involvement. Of course, that was through my RT&J commitment, but I also became involved in several other organizations. And in 2012, I became a member of the Assistance League of Austin. And
Mm.
Assistance League is a national organization, and their local entities are called chapters, but any resemblance to a sorority chapter are purely coincidental. Um, a lot of that reason is because the Assistance League is totally devoted to service. And because we require certain hours of service from our members, the people who can dedicate that time to a large extent are people who have retired from their professions. And a lot of those people are former school principals or teachers. We also have retired just about everything else, healthcare workers, university professors. But anyway, each local chapter can choose its programs that it wants to establish so the chapter can provide service to the community. And years ago, 50 years ago, when Assistance League of Austin was formed, the members at that time decided what they primarily wanted to do was to serve underprivileged kids in Austin.
Mm.
And so another thing they decided to do was, in order to raise funds to be able to do that, they would establish a resale shop called the Thrift House. And the Thrift House was established pretty early on, I think, in the history of the Assistance League of Austin. But over the years, it's become kind of the, what do you call it? The most sought after. I'm searching for the right word. It's a really good resale shop. And when you go in, you feel like you're in a department store because the way things are displayed and shown. And we don't put out anything that's not quality. If somebody donates a coffee cup with a missing handle, we're not going to try to sell that. So people know that they're going to get quality when they come into our store. They know they're going to get reasonable prices. So as it's turned out, the Thrift House has been the flagship moneymaker for the Assistance League. And as a result, our flagship programs are, one is called Operation School Bell, and we buy brand new school clothes where school counselors bring in students ranging from preschool to teenagers to come in and quote unquote shop in our store with a volunteer helping them out.
Mm.
And they get a week's worth of school clothes, shoes, backpacks, jackets at no cost to them at all. It's free for them. And another program we have is called the Toy Cart, where we take brand new toys to Children's Hospital here.
Mm.
And so those are our two main programs, and we have four others that also benefit the children and also young people. For example, people who are aging out of foster care, we provide them things they will need to set up housekeeping, and all that's done at no cost. So the Assistance League is something I've come to believe in with all my heart. and
Mhm.
I'm so proud to be a part of. And it's one of the best organizations I've ever been in because they're constantly looking for new and better ways to do things. The board welcomes input from our members, and I'm just really, really proud and happy to be a part of that. So that's been the main time consumer. But I'm also a member of our PEO chapter, which is a woman's group that provides philanthropy and education to women. And as in AOPI, PEO requires a certain degree of secrecy of its members. And one of those secrets is what PEO stands for. And so we generally say it's a philanthropic and educational organization. My dad said, "Oh, I know what it means. PEO stands for phone each other." And then he would add early and often. But anyway, it's a great organization too. And so I've really enjoyed being more involved with that. And one of these days I'll get more involved with my Austin alumni chapter, but I guess old habits are hard to break. And I still show up at Founders Day and the Christmas party and things like that.
Well, Ginger, thank you so much for sharing this. I actually looked up some of the stuff you were talking about ahead of time, and I was really impressed. The things that you get done through these programs are so
Mhm.
expensive. There's so many people who need them. So it's really lovely to know that you take that work on and you're supporting such a great cause, clothing children and helping them land on their feet after foster care. And
Thank
that's
you.
just really admirable.
Well, and if anybody listening to this is ever in Austin, Texas, we'll be happy to sell you a coffee mug that has a handle on it.
Ginger, looking back over the many things that have occurred in your lifetime, is there any particular event or moment in time that you would like to revisit and or go back and experience again? And would you make the same choices in that situation or would you do something differently?
Hmm, that's a tough question.
I agree.
Let's have the Jeopardy music while I think about it. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is my dad. My dad, as I mentioned, was a journalist.
Mhm.
And he, for many years, worked for the Dallas Morning News. That's a print publication that is very prominent in Texas. And he worked for them for 20 something years in the Capitol Bureau. And he was a correspondent, so he covered Texas politics.
Mhm.
And not only was he so well versed in Texas history and Texas politics, he also was a huge sports fan, and he covered the University of Texas home football games for Sports Illustrated. So it was always fun to be able to pick his brain about politics and sports and all kinds of things. And unfortunately, he developed lymphoma.
Mm.
And after 4 years of fighting that, he died at the age of 70. And I was 46 years old at the time. And that's a fairly young age to die,
Mhm.
by our standards. And as I guess many people feel when they lose a parent, I just never felt like I had enough time with him. And especially during our helter-skelter political climate we've had in the United States for the last few years and seems to be continuing. There are many times I wish I could talk to Dad about this, and
Mhm.
I kind of know what he would have said, but I really miss those opportunities to talk to him about those types of things. And he was, Dad was not only knowledgeable about a lot of things, but he was also fun. He had a great sense of humor, and he was practical and insightful and logical. And an example of that was I mentioned that not always were the executive directors of the state bar that I worked under gems. And I mean that GEMS.
Mhm.
Some of them were very difficult to work with. And I remember at one point went over to mom and dad's because I was so disgusted with the conduct of the executive director at the time. And I was wondering what to do. Should I stay there? Should I stick it out? How could I work for somebody that I thought was unethical and
Mhm.
honestly despicable in the way he handled things and the way he treated people? So after hearing all this, my dad said, well, what's the typical tenure for a state bar executive director? And I said, oh, probably about 4 years. I think that's about average. And he said, well, how far along is this current executive director in that tenure? And I said, oh, I think he's been here about 3 years. And Dad said, well, seems to me you have a choice. You can either quit and go try to get another job someplace else, or you can outlast the executive director. I chose to outlast the executive director. And that was such good, practical, sensible advice that I really treasured that. And as luck would have it, several years later, when we had another executive director that wasn't exactly a gem, that advice came back and I was able to rely on it again. So I guess if I could go back in time and relive some things, it would be having more opportunities to be with Dad.
Mhm.
Dads
That's
have so much wisdom.
mhm.
I remember once I worked at a restaurant in Waterloo as a hostess, and I was awful at it, but I also didn't get any training. And I remember calling home after every shift and just venting to my mom. But this one time, my dad picked up, and he listened, and I was just fuming. And then I stopped fuming, and he said, "Why are you putting up with this shit?" I had a really good talk with the owner, and
Mhm.
then I got some respect after that. So it was a very insightful moment for me.
Thank you, Dad.
Yeah.
Words to live by.
In all this talk about moments where you just want to go, have you ever felt lost or unsure about the future? And is there anything in our ritual, perhaps, a word, a phrase, a verse that helps you find your way and get you grounded?
One of the major things that comes to mind is what I just mentioned about that second executive director I worked for
Mhm.
that I just couldn't agree with. I just didn't like his methods and his shenanigans in terms of the way he skirted the rules and the way he treated the staff and that type of thing. And it was, I guess that all reached the height of my disgust when I was about 3 years away from my retirement. And he was so unethical that I just didn't think I could keep working there. But I remembered what my dad said
Mhm.
about try to outlast him, because at that point in my career in my life, I wouldn't have been able to get another job that had as much responsibility or as much salary. I would need to go work at another state agency to protect my retirement, but there wasn't another state agency that could match what the state bar was doing for me, responsibility wise or salary wise. So I decided to take Dad's advice and outlast this second executive director. And in addition to Dad, a phrase that came to my mind very much when I was going through all that decision was endureth all things.
Mhm.
And as a matter of fact, that particular phrase had come to my mind and still does come to my mind pretty often. And I think that and our motto have really guided me a lot. Being from Texas, we have the reputation of bragging a lot. And one of my favorite explanations for that and sayings about that is no brag, it's fact. But I have to remember that when I'm really proud of things or something I've done, I need to be somewhat humble. But if it's fact, it's not bragging, I guess. I think the founders might have a little problem with that, but so our motto has really, really helped me a lot. And I tell you, one of the most significant things in my life was the result of a brain tumor I had.
Mm.
And I had this brain tumor. When it was diagnosed, it was determined to be about the size of a golf ball. And the doctors didn't know when it'd start growing. They said it could have started growing when I was a baby. So, but it took a long time for it get to be a golf ball size and to
Mm.
give me some issues that I had to take care of. And so this was in 2005, hard to believe, nearly 20 years ago now. And I was very heavily involved in AOPI, had lots of responsibilities. And I thought, oh my goodness, when the word gets out about this, it's going to be like the old game of gossip. It's going to go around the circle and the story is going to change and the prognosis is going to change. And by the time it gets all around the circle, I'm going to be dead in 24 hours. And so being the communicator that I am, I decide, well, so get out in front of this. And so
Mhm.
I wrote email messages to, different entities in AOPI, the executive board, various committees, the staff that I'd worked with, lots of friends, mainly to get the word out that I had a brain tumor. It was not
Mm.
cancerous. My neurologist said if I had a brain tumor, I'd like it to be just like yours because it was fairly easily surgically removed. They didn't anticipate that I would have any long-term health issues as a result. So
Mhm.
if you're going to have a brain tumor, it was pretty positive. And I wanted people to know that. So I put out all this information. Well, I had no idea that as a result of those communications, I would get the most enormous amount of support and love and encouragement from throughout the fraternity. Many AOPI members contacted me who I didn't even know personally, but you know how it goes. Somebody would get an email message and then they'd forward it to somebody else and forward it to somebody else. So I was getting emails, cards, letters, gifts to encourage me during this time. And all of that had such a profound impact on me. I mean, it was so unexpected and so meaningful and so enormously helpful to me that, even though the prognosis was good, the prospect of somebody cutting through your skull and going into your brain to remove something was a little
Mhm.
scary.
Sure.
And, and so I just benefited from that result so much and have been so eternally grateful for it. And I joked at the time that as a result of my having a brain tumor and a result of my telling the world about it, my friends over time who always thought there was something wrong with my brain now had the MRIs to prove that they had been right. But I was just immensely grateful, as I said, for all that. And it not only benefited me personally in my spirit and my optimism, it also absolutely confirmed what I've always believed about AOPI. We're there for each other.
Mhm.
We shouldn't hesitate to ask each other
Yeah.
when we need something, no matter what it is, because the AOPIs will come through. And sometimes they come through when you don't even ask.
Mhm.
All of that was a wonderful affirmation of my AOPI involvement and what this fraternity is and what our members are. And I was pretty unsure about a lot of things at that time, but not after the AOPIs rallied around me.
That is such a testament to the impact that AOPI can have on its members and how it does, bring us together during happy times and during scary times as well.
Absolutely.
Right. Such a great story. Learning about your relationship with your father and the sage advice he gave you, and he sounds like he was quite a character,
He was.
brings up a question about other members of your family. Your mother is still with us, and you're close with both her and your sister, Janet.
Right.
Can you share a story with us about your relationship or your history with those members of your family?
Sure. Well, we've always been very close, and to the extent that when Janet and I were in elementary school, we always wanted our mom to be the homeroom mother, the field trip chaperone, the Girl Scout leader. We just always wanted her to be involved with whatever we were involved in. We just always, now I will say we did have some rocky times when we were teenagers because, teenagers know everything. And, but nothing ever tremendously divisive or very major. So we've always been very close and enjoyed each other's company to the extent that after I retired from the executive board, the three of us made a trip to Switzerland together. And no, it was after I retired. I'm sorry, retired from the state bar. We made a trip to Switzerland together and just had a wonderful time that. And we've taken several other trips, and Janet and I have taken trips together. And what's been really fun about that is that Janet and Mom have benefited from my AOPI friends. An example of that was we went to my second cousin's graduation from high school in Arizona, and Mom and I went. And the first night we were in Arizona, we stayed with an AOPI friend in Phoenix. And then we went up to Sedona for the graduation and came back around through, oh gosh, the name of the city escapes me right now. But anyway, another AOPI friend over there that they spent the night with. And Mom said, I'm beginning to get the picture of why you've stayed involved with AOPI for so long. And then a couple of years ago, several years ago, Janet and I made a trip to Western Canada, started out in Vancouver, where we visited AOPI friends, made the big horseshoe up around to Calgary, and had dinner with Christy Manchell. I said, Christy, Janet and I are going to be there for our last night in Canada. You think you could put together, a gathering of some AOPIs? We could have dinner together. Well, Christy went to work, and guess what she did? I think there were 15 people at the dinner. And so Janet, they like being with Janet, and Janet liked being with them. And so Christy came over to me during the dinner and said, we want to initiate Janet. And I said, oh, okay, that'd be great. And Christy said, can we do it right now? And I said, do you have a ritual book? And she said, not with me. And I said, have you gone through the proper channels? And she said, no, but you're the chairman of RT&J. You ought to be able to improve this. I said, Christy, in answer to your question, no. But I thought that was such a kick that they enjoyed Janet so much. And AOPI has benefited me and my family. So, and now my mom has dementia. She's 96 and for several years has lived in a wonderful healthcare center in a retirement community here in Austin. And Janet lives 200 miles away from me in Fort Worth, but she's made it a big point to come every month, if not more often, so that we can spend time with Mom. And it's kind of hard to describe, but these are really special times too. Mom can't communicate very well, but we know she's happy and she can express her joy in being with us. And so I think we're even more close now than we have been at many other times in our lives. And Janet and I are just really treasuring now this time that we can share with Mom.
And it's such a relief as I'm coming into the era of having aging parents with declining health, but knowing that they're well taken care of, that they're somewhere comfortable and safe. Because certainly my father also has dementia, and just knowing that other people are involved in their care can make the relationships with the other members of your family that much better, because that worry, that concern is not weighing on your shoulders.
That's exactly right, Dana. And I appreciate your saying that. That's what I would, and I know it's hard in a lot of cases. In our case, Mom decided when it was time to move out of her 3,000 square foot house to the retirement community. Mom decided when it was time for her to quit driving at night, for the time for her to sell her car. So she's and manage her finances so it wouldn't be a burden on Janet or me. And
Mhm.
so we've just been tremendously fortunate. And I feel for the families that have to make the decision for their parents to do those things. I can only guess how extremely difficult that
Yeah.
can be. But you're exactly right. When you get to that point where you know that your loved ones are being cared for and they're safe and happy,
Mm-hmm.
it just means the world.
It does.
Oh, that's such a beautiful story. Thank you, Ginger, for sharing that. And I really hope your mom continues to be happy and experience your presence and Janet's presence
Mm-hmm.
whenever you're able to visit. And it sounds like she gets pretty frequent visits, which
Thank
is
you.
very heartwarming. I think she's a very lucky lady.
Well, thank you.
She
We
has
are
very
too.
loving daughters.
One other little anecdote about Mom. Before she developed dementia, every once in a while she'd say to Janet and me, "Did y'all have happy childhoods?" And we
Oh.
say, "Oh my gosh, yes." What were those TV shows in the 50s and 60s where the mother always stayed at home and was always there for the kids? And uh,
Mm-hmm.
the Cleaver family, was that Leave It to Beaver, I think. And Janet always said, we had a Cleaver-like family. We were so fortunate with the opportunities we had, thanks to Dad's profession and Mom being such a wonderful person to be with, that we had a very happy childhood, and I hope and a very happy adulthood for the most part. A
Mm-hmm.
little brain tumor here and there wasn't so happy, but I think that's the real legacy that Mom has left us, and I think deep down inside, I hope she knows that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few more questions that we wanted to ask you, but I think that this is a really nice place to leave it at for our
Mm-hmm.
listeners and just reflect on our relationships, whether it's with parents, friends, AOPI, and just let this one settle in. What do you
Mm-hmm.
think?
I think that sounds great. And again, I want to thank the two of you and the Sea to Sky Alumni Chapter. When I heard you were embarking on this podcast, I thought, there they go again. I'm just so proud to be a member of the alumni chapter and wish I could cheer you on from a closer distance.
I'm so honored to be in the same space with the two of you, and thank you very much for your time and all of the love that you both give AOPI and our sisters.
Well, this has been great. I've had a lot of fun doing it, and I appreciate the opportunity. You two are super duper, and I'm proud to be in your orbit.
Well, thank you, Ginger, for participating. And oh my gosh, I learned so much about you, and it's just been an inspiring time to be with you.
Well, thank you. Right back at the two of you.
Thanks for listening to Sea to Sky podcast. For Sisters by Sisters with Marina Thompson and Dana Moreland. Brought to you by Sea to Sky Alumna Chapter of Alpha Omicron Pi. Till next time.